Let's continue, shall we? 1989. So we're steamrolling forward. So for anybody wondering, when are you going to cover this one? Just going in chronological order. I'm going with every team. So everybody, there were some people who waited from August until now. Like, when's he going to go back? And every now and then, people would ask me, say, when are you going to go back and do that finalist series you started? And now it's daily. So once I found the time, once we're not looking at 10, 20 games seemingly every day, I have time. Montreal's an interesting story because there's a lot of ends and a lot of beginnings. And this is in between two cup wins for them. And it's interesting to see how the roster changed over those 7 years. This was a season where Montreal and Calgary appeared to be on a collision course pretty much from the start of the playoffs. And they had collided in 86 as well. 89 was a year where Calgary again won that Battle of Alberta. They won the Stanley Cup, though. It's the only time Calgary's ever won the Stanley Cup. And they did it at the expense of the Montreal Canadiens, who hadn't lost in the finals since 1967. And, coincidentally, still haven't lost in the finals since this year. The only other time they made it back to the finals was 1993, and they won it. So in this series, it is the only time I'll wear Montreal garb. It is the only time I will discuss the Montreal Canadiens. In the first round, Hartford did their best, but their best wasn't good enough. Montreal wins Game 1 6-2. They win Game 2 3-2. Both games in Hartford went to overtime. They won the first one 5-4 and the second one 4-3. And as a Whalers fan, I wasn't happy. And I had to keep that because next up was Boston. Well, of course, I talked about the 1988 Bruins yesterday and how they knocked off Montreal. And yeah, this is finally, no. Montreal beats Boston 3-2, and then they beat them 3-2 again, this time in overtime. They win the third game 5-4. They lost the fourth game 3-2, and they won the fifth game 3-2. And that led to some interesting discussions from my dad, who had a way of really, really rubbing it in when his team won. And he did, and huzzah. We'll get to the 1990 Stanley Cup finalists tomorrow, and that's an interesting story too. But I digress. They move on from Boston. They play Philly in the next round. Well, of course, this is where I gotta make a turn, because based on incidents I'd seen with Philly fans in previous years and just the way the Flyers had played, I was cheering for Montreal, which was unusual for me and unusual for Montreal already at this point. But you got to soldier through it. Philadelphia wins Game 1 3-1, loses Game 2 3-0. And then the momentum shifted. Montreal wins the next two games 5-1 and 3-0. They lose the fifth game in overtime 2-1, and they win the sixth game 4-2. And thanks to the NHL changing the rules about bench clearing brawls after their schmozzle that they had before that, there's not quite that level of animosity or nastiness between them this time around. It's still there, because you still have Ron Hextall, and you still have a lot of players here that may not be very well liked. And there was the Hextall head swinging at Chelios and trying to take his head off incident. But as a general series, it wasn't that bad. So we move on to the finals for Calgary. Chelios still has his head. There are people who weren't Chris Chelios fans that would make comments about that, and I'll go ahead and allow it. But anyways, in the finals, they lost the first game 3-2, did those Montreal Canadiens, but they won the second 4-2. Then it gets weird. They win the third game 4-3, and they won it in double overtime. And I remember I'm in high school when this is going on, and there's a debate going on between friends of mine and myself about whether we want to see Montreal or Calgary win the Cup. And there were a lot of us that said we'd like to see Calgary win it because they've never won it, and there were Montreal fans who said, "Well, we don't care. We want Montreal to win all the time." And we were like, "Look, you guys have got enough Stanley Cups. Let somebody else have it." And coming out of Game 3, it looked like Montreal was saying no. Game 4, Calgary wins 4-2. They won Game 5 3-2, and they won Game 6 4-2. And they did this over a team led by Pat Burns. Pat Burns would not win a Stanley Cup until 2003, when he did so with the New Jersey Devils. And this was a time where, honestly, I liked Pat Burns. And while I may not have been a Montreal fan, I was a fan of individual players on the team. Let's get into that. The leading scorer in those playoffs was Bobby Smith with 8 goals and 11 assists. I always thought Bobby Smith was an underrated forward. Chris Chelios, 4 goals and 15 assists. Matt Snaslund, 4 goals and 11 assists, also underrated. I liked him too. Russ Courtnall, 8 goals and 5 assists. I liked him almost as much as his brother Jeff, but not quite. Peter Svoboda, 1 goals and 11 assists. Stefan Richer, 6 goals and 5 assists. I was never a Richer fan. Mike McPhee, 4 goals and 7 assists. I did like him. Brian Skrudland, 2 goals and 8 assists. Larry Robinson, 2 goals and 8 assists. As his career wound down, he would find himself in LA not long after this. Guy Carbonneau, 4 goals and 5 assists, and I loved Guy Carbonneau. Shane Corson, 4 goals and 5 assists. Did not love Shane Corson. Ryan Walter, 3 goals and 5 assists. One of my favorite players. Mike Keane, 4 goals and 3 assists. Claude Lemieux, everybody loves Claude. No, what's the opposite of... Yeah, that's what it is. 4 goals and 3 assists for him. And Bob Gainey, in his swan song, his final postseason, 1 goal and 4 assists for 5 points. Patrick Roy. This was the only Stanley Cup final he ever reached without winning. So Patrick Roy, 12-6 in these playoffs, 2.09 goals against, and a .920 save percentage during the live puck era. When goals were going in right, left, and center, he said no. So Calgary overcame that, and they managed to put up some goals against him, enough to win, and they prevented enough at the other end where their goaltender was having a great season, Mike Vernon. So Mike Vernon and Patrick Roy meet in 1986 as rookies, and they meet again in 1989 as veteran players, and, the result is the opposite. Calgary wins it. As I said, Roy's only lost in the finals. Montreal's first finals loss since 1967, and they lost Game 6 at home, which was very unusual. And I remember there was a big hullabaloo made about that at the time, that Montreal was down 3-2, and they couldn't lose this one at home. And then they did. Bob Gainey, Mike Green, and Lanny McDonald. This was their final Stanley Cup finals. Their final games as hockey players. All 3 of them retired following this series. And for Bob Gainey, it was quite a time. And it was interesting because you have Carbonneau and Gainey on the same team. So if this team was out there now and you're looking at Patrick Roy's stats, I guarantee you the argument would be Bob Gainey, Mike Keane, Shane Corson, Guy Carbonneau. Yeah, Patrick Roy has really good stats, but look at the defensive forwards they can throw out on the ice from Montreal. These guys are amazing. And you got Chris Chelios on the blue line, great two-way defenseman. Yeah, Roy's numbers are nice, but... and then Gainey retires, and Patrick Roy didn't suffer a bit. So yeah, just throwing that out there. But it was an interesting ride because, again, I didn't cheer for them against Hartford. I didn't cheer for them against Boston, for sure. I did cheer for them against Philly, and then I didn't cheer for them against Calgary. That's kind of how things work. Where you're looking at it as kind of like chess pieces. Like, okay, I want this one protected. And that year, even though Calgary had knocked out Vancouver, and I didn't like how it happened, I still cheered for them to win their first Stanley Cup because I thought that was a good story. I thought that Edmonton having 4 at this point, they had 4. I thought that was plenty, and I thought Calgary at least getting 1 would be nice to show that the Battle of Alberta wasn't completely lopsided. Anyways, there you go. There's the 1989 Montreal Canadiens in all their glory, and almost Stanley Cup glory. Thank you guys very much for watching. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And thank you very much for watching. We'll look at 1990 tomorrow.